the racial situation in Kansas City. You talked about the vibrant scene. Did whites and blacks mix back then, Chuck, or was it segregated?
Well, Kansas City was the first stop outside the Deep South, and that's how that really created 18th and Vine. And there was segregation. There was segregation in Kansas City up until the 1960s. It wasn't quite as Jim Crow as down south, though. I mean, for example, you had Local 627, which was the African American Union, and you had 34, which was the white union. And you did have, and so there was racial segregation, but in the clubs on 12th Street, you did have what they called black and tan clubs. African Americans and whites both attended the Reno Club. And there were other clubs on 12th Street too. Often, though, it would be a situation where maybe the African Americans are sitting on the floor and the whites are sitting up in the balcony. So Kansas City was a racist place, and there was segregation, but it wasn't as bad as Mississippi. And that's why a lot of musicians came here.
Yeah, well, there's a story in your book about when Bird and Diz were playing with Earl Hines' band, and Dizzy, the audience, you couldn't mix with the audience. The black musicians played these white dances, and there was one time where Dizzy was alone, and he was about to be attacked, and Bird stepped up and rescued him. Could you share that with us, Chuck?
Well, they were traveling down south with Earl Father Hines, and this cracker came up and started insulting Gillespie, calling him boy and throwing a nickel, done to play a tune for him, because Gillespie was on stage at playing the piano. And after the gig, Gillespie used the white-only restroom because there was nobody there, and when he came out, he saw a shadow behind him, and this guy hit Dizzy over the head with a champagne bottle. And bounced off his head, and Parker intervened and called this guy a cur and said, "You attacked my friend, you cur." And the guy didn't quite know what to think about it. It was this black guy calling him a cur in a white club. And so he came to his rescue. But, that's one of the things that about, traveling down south with Earl Father Hines, they faced prejudice at every corner. When Bird was traveling with Jay McShann down south, he and Walter Brown were smoking cigarettes on a front porch where they were staying in the rooming house because there were no hotels for them. And two cops pulled him off the porch and beat he and Walter Brown so bad, Gene Ramey said you could hang hats on the knots in their head. And as a result, he wrote a song called What Christ Loved. Later, he would make it into Yardbird Suite, which is one of his more joyous compositions. So he took really a tragedy and turned it into a triumph, but with this composition.
Yeah, well, sadly, in many ways, the situation has really not changed that much.
No.
This whole thing that's happening now, I mean, just every day, the treatment of African Americans by the militarized police in the United States is not that much different than the treatment that musicians traveling in the South got during that period.
I tell you, the situation is just as unpredictable now as it was then for black men, especially, and black women as well. But it's just as unpredictable, and I feel precarious and sometimes dangerous because things can change in an instant. Driving down the street on a beautiful sunny day, and next thing you know, going over to your cousin's house on a Sunday or whatever. And next thing you know, and we've watched plenty of documentation of those times that were more blatant, and that's probably only the tip of the iceberg because nobody had cell phones back then, and so it's not like it's in a way more, it's just being captured more now. Yeah. And I think that's that documentation, picture is worth 1,000 words. And when you see it on videotape, kind of hard to say that didn't happen. So, those guys were extremely brave. Bird, that's why I always say, like Chuck says, it's triumph over adversity. When I hear his sound, when he played, that always, that was his horn was his sanctuary, and the bandstand was his altar with all those guys. And it could leave all the troubles of Jim Crow and whatever they went through that day and come together on a bandstand and make this holy music that just was coming from a place where no one had ever been. And it's still so powerful today. People got to remember, when you listen to those, what they call old records, those were young people on those records. Just like y'all people are young today. Those were young folks doing all that stuff. Like the civil rights, those were young people, So, they were rebel rousers, as they want to call them, and that music was, they had the older ones in front of them. Some loved them and some embraced them. Some of them snubbed them and tried to put them down. Those, Bird, was a young man, died at 34. My gosh, that's the whole thing that I had to grasp my head around with Clifford Brown and them guys. And they looked so mature. And they carried themselves as grown men. Even Martin, you look at those pictures, hard to believe he was in his 20s. And Bird, so young, but yet so brave and so committed to what they had to say. And they weren't wasting any time. With Bird, it wasn't about imitation. All them guys, you had to find your own voice and be yourself. You didn't have time to imitate anybody. There really wasn't anybody that imitated anybody. The best I could think of off the top of my head is Paul Quinochet. He was called the vice pres because everything that when Lester Young put something out, Paul Quinochet would be on it. But that's an exception to the rule. And Bird represented that individuality and that courage, to put it out there.